Hello, my name is Alexandra Alvis, and I'm the Special Collections Reference Librarian at Smithsonian Libraries. Illuminated manuscripts are some of the most beautiful and dynamic objects to survive from the Middle Ages. In his autobiography Praeterita, artist and art historian John Ruskin refers to an illuminated Book of Hours as a fairy cathedral full of painted windows. Unlike intricate medieval jewelry or ornamented chalices, manuscripts like these are still used in nearly the same way as they were when they were new. They are held, their pages turned, their illuminations are considered sequentially. While many of us are used to seeing these treasures inside glass boxes, out of reach of curious fingers, researchers and librarians regularly use these fascinating artifacts. Far from being just pretty faces, illuminated manuscripts can inform how we understand medieval social history, the art of bookmaking, and the history of religious devotion, among other things. Like their book form, made with motion in mind, the beautiful and enduring iconography in these manuscripts is not and never has been static. Medieval users viewed their relationship to illuminated religious manuscripts as a two-way street, more like a window than a flat image. Understanding how medieval people dynamically interacted with illuminated religious manuscripts physically and ideologically is the main topic of this lecture, but it is also important to note how that dynamism has carried on to the present day. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of medieval manuscripts, let's review some definitions. First, a fundamental question. What is a manuscript? Historian Christopher de Hamel tells us that the most common whole object to come down from us from the Middle Ages is the manuscript. The key definition of manuscript is in the name. Latin manu, for by hand, and scriptus, written, literally handwritten. Although anything written by hand can be called a manuscript, we are largely looking at manuscripts in the codex format in this talk. What do we mean by codex? A codex is really the thing we think of when we think of a book. As opposed to a scroll, deed, or loose sheets, the codex format is really it. At its most basic, a codex is a document with multiple pages sandwiched between covers. And of course this is in contrast to a roll or a scroll, as we see the scribe writing on in the lower left miniature on this slide. And what is a miniature, you ask? It doesn't just refer to a little illustration. This word comes from the Latin miniere, to color with minium, which is a pigment made of red lead. Generally, miniature refers to the contained scenes in a manuscript, but it can also refer to more complex initials. So what makes a manuscript illuminated? Well, there are two schools of thought on this issue, and it can be rather contestable depending on who you're talking to. The most prominent school says that the use of gold or silver leaf on miniatures or initials makes a manuscript illuminated, due to the fact that these metals reflect light and are shiny. However, historian Michelle P. Brown calls illumination the use of luminous colors, which is really anything aside from black. I find it difficult not to classify something like the Lindisfarne Gospels, seen here on the right, as an illuminated manuscript, so I'm soundly in the luminous color camp. Finally, what do we mean when we say medieval? The medieval period, or the Middle Ages, lasts from roughly the 5th century to 1450, although many of the manuscripts mentioned in this lecture are from the High and the Late Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages last from around the year 1000 to the year 1347, between a population boom and normal climate to the Black Plague and the Little Ice Age. A good rule of thumb is to remember that the Middle Ages start with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and end with Gutenberg's invention of the movable type press. The lines are fairly blurry, though. This was not like a switch being flicked on and off. Medieval traditions, particularly in bookmaking, carried on into later centuries. Now that we are acquainted with what illuminated manuscripts are, we can begin to explore what they were used for. In a time before print and paper, options for communicating were oral or manuscript. Many genres of manuscript existed beyond the religious texts many of us are most familiar with, and many were illuminated, including classical literature, medical works, bestiaries, and hunting guides. But illuminations in religious manuscripts were particularly heavy with meaning for medieval readers. Once only the domain of the clergy, medieval manuscripts became more widely accessible by the end of the High Middle Ages. This is thanks in part to the demand of the nobility. It would be difficult to use a missal or a breviary, both structured for liturgical use, for personal devotion. The classic image of monks in cloisters toiling over a manuscript would be accurate until around the mid-13th century, as you can see this nice little illustration of Hugo Pictor on the right. But as demands grew, manuscript production was divided among professional artisans, from scribes to rubricators to illuminators. This fellow, Simon Benning, is featured in a self-portrait with an illumination in progress on his desk. These professionally produced manuscripts were first for use in the personal chapels of the nobility, but eventually were used for personal devotion outside the chapel. This is thanks both to the rise of the middle class and the rise of literacy. So what kinds of religious books were medieval people reading? Most books outside religious works were beyond the means of even wealthier medieval people. The most common surviving medieval manuscript is the Book of Hours, the bestseller of the Middle Ages. This book evolved from the breviary, which was a required possession of monks and nuns, which contained the Psalms, hymns for Mass, and the Hours of the Virgin. An intermediate type of manuscript is the Psalter, which left out the hymns. Books of Hours always contained the Hours of the Virgin. As the name implies, these prayers were meant to be said at different hours of the day and night in veneration of the Holy Virgin Mary. But Books of Hours also offered a lot of opportunities for personalization, from content to decoration. Books of Hours always contained a calendar, which would be altered to highlight regional feasts and saints' days. Books of Hours could also include cycles about your name saint, and many Books of Hours made for female patrons also included the Hours of St. Catherine, which were similar in their cyclical nature to the Hours of the Virgin. Books of Hours could even include you if you had the money. Cameos of the commissioners of Books of Hours cost extra, and we will be talking about them more in depth later. However, at around the cost of 43 days of skilled labor or 3 cows, Books of Hours were still unattainably expensive to most. This continues to be true today, as you can see on the image of the manuscript on the right, which costs $495,000 if you would like to purchase it from a private dealer. Now, when we look at a spread or a page from a religious manuscript, there can be a lot going on visually. So let's go over the anatomy of an illuminated manuscript. The earliest religious manuscripts had vast, empty white borders, which were perfect for note-taking, and it makes them slightly less visually complex. So a lot of our examples are going to be coming from high and late books. First, let's consider the text. Visual elements in religious manuscripts were seen as less than the text, although not by a lot. The scribe always worked first and then left space for the illuminators to come later. Some medieval writers implied that looking at miniatures was just as important and even performed the same function as reading the text word for word. Illuminations were meant to work in tandem with the text. One could not be properly read without the other. Sticking with the textual theme, we'll now move on to initials. Readers oriented themselves within the text using oversized, sometimes ornamental initials. These served as guideposts in a time before text formatting as we know it. Without these initials, readers were faced with an unbroken wall of text, as you can see in this example. The simplest embellished initials were rubricated rather than illuminated. In this example, you can see in shades of red and blue. Rubrication, or rubricated, comes from the Latin word rubrico, to color red. There was a hierarchy of style and complexity in the initials to demarcate passages, sections, chapters, books, etc. Some of these initials went above and beyond the call of duty, as this one did in the Book of Kells. This initial comes at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, describing the Nativity story, so the scribe really wanted to let you know that you were starting something important. Now let's move beyond the central portion of a page of a Book of Hours into the border. The complex and lush area around the miniatures began as plant growth sprouting from initials, but it grew increasingly more complex as years moved forward. The border functions as a literal margin between the text and the miniature and the rest of the page, and sometimes it features figures that were indeed outside of the grace of God. The border was where the world of the profane, everyday life, met the world of the holy, and it was an inherently liminal space. It was also a space for illuminators to innovate and have fun. The images you sometimes see in the media of snails fighting knights, or strange figures of rabbits and dogs fighting each other, one mounted on a noble steed of a bearded man-snail, or dogs taking men on walks on leashes. All of these were things that subverted the natural order of life, and therefore appeared in the margins. The margins were also home to curious hybrid creatures, sometimes called grotesques. These could take on many forms, including the bearded snail man that we saw earlier, or even bird dogs, bird men, all sorts of crazy combinations that you would be surprised that medieval artisans could think up. Trompe-l'oeil was a popular technique employed in these borders, particularly in the later Middle Ages. Artists drew plants, insects, and other animals from direct observation rather than copying from an exemplar. These borders could get incredibly complex and featured quite a variety of elements, from the real to the imaginary to the purely decorative. These borders were also opportunities for the commissioners of books of hours and religious manuscripts to show off how much money they spent on the manuscript in question. Now let's move a little closer to the central vignette of Illuminations and look at the concept of the owner cameo. These cameos of the commissioners of manuscripts can either appear in the border, entreating holy figures to allow them into grace, or actually even taking part in the holy scene. These owner portraits were still confined to the realm of more expensive books. For example, a Book of Hours purchased by an average merchant family would be surprisingly cookie-cutter. Pattern books existed for miniatures and decorations, and this kind of production kept the costs down. And finally, let's explore the central miniature, or window, of an illuminated page. Books of Hours and other religious manuscripts were understood to have a dynamism about them, acting as both literal and figurative windows to the holy. Just as visible light passes through a window, the light of the holy could shine through illuminations. Medieval thought held that eyes were the gateway to the heart, so by absorbing knowledge this way, it had more of an impact. Miniatures also offered a way for users to look into the world of stories from the Bible and saints, bringing them more into tune with the joys and suffering of holy figures. The very design of the miniatures in religious manuscripts echoes windows. This incredible view of the windows of Sainte-Chapelle truly resembles the frame of the Annunciation from the Belles Heures du Duc de Berry, which is a French manuscript from 1409. Modern viewers often remark on the strangeness of the figures in medieval manuscripts, but it is important to remember that illuminators were not striving for realism. It is understood that the window in the book was looking on a time and place that was difficult, if not impossible, for humans to comprehend. Some illuminations were more explicit in their window symbolism than others. As I mentioned before, the shapes of many miniatures reinforce the window function, with their vaulted shapes which mirror not just church windows, but castle windows. This miniature from the Hours of Mary of Burgundy shows the reader of the manuscript engaged in reading the manuscript, while behind her she is shown again in the scene kneeling at the feet of the Virgin Mary. This is to demonstrate how she is transported spiritually into this scene by reading her manuscript. Going a step beyond visual and mental interaction, some medieval readers actually physically touched or kissed their manuscripts, venerating the figures depicted. This is a prime example of how the line between book and actual divine presence was very blurry. The Virgin Mary was a popular subject of such physical devotions, and in many manuscripts, miniatures of the Virgin are actually smeared from devotional kissing or touching. On the opposite end of the spectrum from kissing and touching, in order to show a true rejection of the influence of the devil, users would deface images emblematic of evil. Here, the illumination of the beast has actually been struck through several times with a knife. So how do we, in the 21st century, understand or misunderstand illuminated manuscripts? Today we see illumination-inspired motifs on everything from fashion to home decor to wrapping paper. The medieval period is also an enduring theme in movies and TV shows, although their understanding of manuscript aesthetics can be a little lacking. This is what's known as remediation, a process through which new media transforms older media, retaining some of the original aspects and discarding others. Thanks to ongoing digitization projects, medieval manuscripts are now more accessible than ever before, and their images are easy to download and remix. Unfortunately, though, the 21st century has lost a lot of the original context of medieval manuscripts and how they were used. This loss of context is perhaps nowhere more tragic than as exemplified by modern alt-right movements. Rather than understanding the Middle Ages as the cross-cultural melting pot that they were, people in these movements have a fantasy about a racially pure period that never existed. Knights, particularly the Knights Templar and Crusaders, are popular among followers of alt-right movements, as they are seen as a military resistance to an outside, non-white, non-Christian threat. In reality, the Crusades were an issue of wealth and land ownership as much as a holy mission, but that's a subject for a whole other lecture. Part of this misunderstanding is thanks in part to 18th and 19th century scholars using their racial biases to write certain groups out of history, partly as justification for ongoing European colonialism. Remediation is nothing new, although it is unfortunate that it is so easy to separate the original material from its context today. But people have been reinterpreting and misinterpreting manuscripts for a long time. This reinterpretation of the Middle Ages and illuminated manuscripts started immediately after the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance. The invention of movable type did not stop the manuscript tradition in its tracks. Early books are very much a synthesis of manuscript formatting and print innovations. In fact, until the early 16th century, many decorative elements of printed books were still added by hand, such as rubrication and ornamental initials. Illustrations were also enlivened by hand to make them appear illuminated. Until the mid-16th century, manuscript books of hours were still more popular than printed ones. But the art style of particularly the early Middle Ages was very much out of fashion and seen as naive compared to the advances being made in perspective and portraiture. Compare the awkward perspective of this miniature from a Flanders Book of Hours to one of the classics of Renaissance art, Pietro Perugino's Christ Giving the Keys to St. Peter. The negative, disparaging view of the Middle Ages continued in the 18th and 19th centuries. In this period, most manuscripts from the early Middle Ages, and even many from the High Middle Ages, were considered to be quote-unquote crude and monkish. But other manuscripts, particularly the high-quality ones made for the nobility or extremely rich, were desirable to collectors, no matter what the cost. In the 18th century, the practice of cutting miniatures out of books to resell them was established, and it really took off in the 19th century. John Ruskin himself was a notorious manuscript butcher, although he claimed to do all of his dirty work in the name of art history. John Harthen identifies what he calls the Missal Age as a subdivision of the Gothic Revival, a movement which arose in the mid-19th century which aimed to resituate aspects of the Middle Ages in art and culture. The Missal Age was characterized by a near fetishization of medieval illuminations, as characterized by men like John Ruskin, who had little care for the manuscripts as objects. This ghastly practice has an upside, however. Some manuscripts survive as fragments today that would not have survived at all as whole books, and it means that more people have access to this kind of history. We live in fast-paced and tumultuous times, where history is easily robbed of its context in order to be presented as easy-to-interpret bite-sized chunks. The beautiful illuminations in medieval manuscripts can easily fall prey to this decontextualization, resulting in at best mild befuddlement and at worst fuel for modern hate groups. It is impossible to cover all the ins and outs of medieval manuscripts in this short lecture. I didn't even get to talk about my favorite parts, their bindings. But I hope this will encourage you to learn more about these multifaceted objects. And of course, as a librarian, I hope that this learning will involve going to a rare book reading room and actually handling a manuscript yourself. Thank you so much for listening to my lecture, and I'm so sorry that I wasn't able to deliver it in person. Thank you to the Ellen Knoll for having me, and thank you to all of you again for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at alvisa@si.edu, and I would love to talk to you more about illuminated manuscripts and other rare books.